A fearless attorney takes a stand against corruption and racial injustice in a city drowning in crime. She's a thorn in the side of powerful criminals, and now they want her gone. Framed, betrayed, and thrown behind bars by a rigged system, she faces an impossible fight. But can she turn the tables, expose the truth, and reclaim justice? Like and comment below to let me know what you think. Richmond Falls was a city with a legacy tainted by power, corruption, and injustice. Once a thriving industrial hub, it had long since decayed into a battleground where the wealthy and powerful controlled the narrative, and the marginalized bore the weight of a broken system. Decades of unchecked police misconduct, backroom deals, and judicial manipulation had turned the justice system into a tool of oppression rather than fairness. At the center of this decayed world stood Naomi Carter, a bold, relentless defense attorney who had spent her career fighting for those the system sought to bury. A woman of sharp intellect and unyielding conviction, Naomi had seen firsthand how Richmond Falls operated, how innocent black and brown men and women were railroaded into convictions, how evidence was manufactured, and how those in power crushed anyone who dared to challenge them. But unlike many who had learned to stay silent, Naomi refused to look away. That defiance made her a target. Detective Victor Langley, a seasoned officer with a reputation for making problems disappear, had ruled the Richmond Falls Police Department with an iron fist. Corrupt, calculated, and utterly ruthless, he saw Naomi not as a minor nuisance but as a direct threat. She had won cases that embarrassed the department, exposed unlawful arrests, and blocked his officers from sweeping misconduct under the rug. Langley believed in one truth: above all, power had to be maintained at any cost. And Naomi Carter was a woman who had to be dealt with. Sitting across from his longtime enforcer, Sergeant Paul Greer, in the dim backroom of a seedy bar, Langley laid out the plan. "She thinks she's untouchable," Langley muttered, his fingers tapping against his whiskey glass. "That ends now." Greer smirked. "A possession charge won't be enough. She'll fight it. We need something big. Something that makes her name so toxic she'll never show her face in a courtroom again." Langley exhaled, nodding. "Drugs. Money laundering. Federal charges. We paint her as the worst kind of criminal." It was a familiar playbook, one they had used countless times. But this time they needed backing from higher up. Enter Judge Leonard Vaughn, a man drowning in gambling debts, a judge who had built his career trading verdicts for bribes. Vaughn owed Langley. Years ago, Langley had made a DUI charge against the judge disappear, a favor that had kept Vaughn's reputation intact. Now, it was time to collect. A late-night meeting in Vaughn's private study sealed the deal, a favor for a favor. Vaughn would sign off on warrants, deny bail, and ensure Naomi never saw justice. The trap was set. Naomi had no idea that, as she walked into the Richmond Falls courthouse that morning, arguing a civil rights case against the department, Langley and Greer were already pulling strings behind the scenes. In the next 48 hours, they would fabricate evidence, plant drugs in her home, and orchestrate a raid so public, so devastating, that her name would be synonymous with crime. The city that once applauded her courage would soon turn against her. And by the time she realized what was happening, it would already be too late. Naomi Carter had spent her evening reviewing case files, unaware that her entire world was about to implode. Across the city, Langley and Greer were setting the final pieces of their plan into motion. The fake paper trail had been established: fraudulent bank transactions linking Naomi to offshore accounts, burner phones with fabricated text messages discussing drug shipments, and ledgers falsely implicating her in a money laundering scheme. It was airtight, designed to make even the most skeptical observer believe she had built a secret empire beneath her pristine legal career. But none of it would matter without the spectacle. They needed the public to see her fall. At exactly 9:42 p.m. Richmond Falls PD's tactical unit stormed apartment with full-force battering rams, floodlights, assault rifles raised. Neighbors peeked through their blinds as armored officers shattered her front door, yelling for her to get on the ground. Naomi, startled and confused, barely had time to process what was happening before she was forced to the floor. A knee pressed into her back as cold steel cuffs snapped around her wrists. She tried to speak, to ask for a warrant, to demand an explanation, but her voice was drowned out by the barking of orders, the ransacking of her home, and the triumphant smirk of Paul Greer standing in the doorway. Well, Greer mused, arms crossed as he watched his men tear apart Naomi's bookshelves, her kitchen cabinets, her office drawers. Looks like we found ourselves a criminal mastermind. A moment later, an officer triumphantly held up a Ziploc bag filled with white powder baking soda carefully packaged to resemble cocaine. Another found a burner phone planted beneath the bathroom sink. Naomi's head spun. She knew exactly what was happening, but she also knew it wouldn't matter. No one would believe her. This wasn't just about ruining her name, this was about erasing her completely. The next few hours moved in a blur. Mugshots, fingerprints, the sterile coldness of a holding cell. The next morning she was paraded into court, shackled, her pristine reputation shattered in an instant. Cameras flashed as reporters clamored to capture the fall of the city's so-called justice warrior. Judge Leonard Vaughn, already briefed on how to play his role, feigned neutrality as he scanned the falsified case file before delivering his ruling. Bail denied, he announced, his voice hollow, mechanical, already bought and paid for. Naomi didn't flinch, but inside she felt something crack. She wasn't just being silenced, she was being buried alive. And as she was led back into the darkness of her cell, the world outside continued without her, convinced that Naomi Carter was nothing more than another criminal who had finally been caught. The walls of Naomi's cell were cold, the air thick with the metallic scent of confinement. She sat on the narrow cot, her mind racing through every detail of the case against her. It was too perfect, too orchestrated, every piece of evidence lined up like a script written in advance. She had spent years defending the innocent against setups just like this, but now she was on the other side, and the system she had fought so hard against was closing in around her. No phone calls, no visitors, just the suffocating silence of a justice system designed to break people like her. Outside the jail, Richmond Falls buzzed with reaction. The news cycle spun with sensational headlines: respected attorney caught in drug ring scandal, Naomi Carter, legal champion or criminal mastermind. Public opinion splintered. Some refused to believe the allegations, but others, primed by years of systemic bias, saw her downfall as inevitable. After all, how often did people like her climb so high without eventually falling? But Naomi wasn't alone. Across the city, Pastor Elijah Morris, a longtime activist and community leader, stood in front of his packed congregation, fire in his voice. This is not justice. This is a system that has spent decades crushing those who dare to stand against it. His sermon ignited a movement. By nightfall, people gathered outside the courthouse, chanting Naomi's name, demanding answers. What started as a small protest swelled into a force that Richmond Falls couldn't ignore. Inside the Richmond Falls Gazette newsroom, investigative journalist Kayla Brooks scrolled through Naomi's case file, her gut churning. Something didn't add up. The timeline of the police raid didn't match the department's own records, and the burner phone log seemed oddly neat. Too clean for a case this messy. Kayla had spent years exposing the city's corruption, and this smelled like a setup. She made a call, her voice steady. "Get me everything we have on Langley and Greer. I think they just got sloppy." Meanwhile, within the Richmond Falls Police Department, Officer Marcus Dean sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He had always known Langley and Greer were dirty, but what he saw now was worse than he had imagined. Surveillance footage from the night of Naomi's arrest showed officers entering her apartment before the official raid had even begun. His pulse quickened. That was impossible. The search warrant hadn't been signed yet. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. If he moved forward with this, he would be risking everything. But if he stayed silent, he would be complicit in destroying an innocent woman's life. Naomi, locked away and isolated, had no idea that outside, the cracks in Langley's plan had already begun to form. The people she had fought for were fighting back, and for the first time since her arrest, the tide was beginning to turn. Langley sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The protests outside had grown louder, the chants of Naomi Carter's name echoing through the streets like a warning. He clenched his jaw as he scrolled through the latest news articles. The Richmond Falls Gazette had started asking the wrong questions. The kind that made people doubt the airtight case he had built. The kind that turned a carefully orchestrated takedown into a public relations nightmare. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, Officer Marcus Dean stared at the damning surveillance footage on his screen. It was undeniable Greer and his men had entered Naomi's apartment before they legally could, proving the raid was staged. His hands trembled as he copied the footage onto a flash drive. If Langley caught him, he was finished. But if he stayed silent, Naomi Carter would rot in a prison cell for a crime she didn't commit. He took a deep breath, shoved the drive into his pocket, and made his decision. At the Richmond Falls Gazette, Kayla Brooks pieced together the inconsistencies, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The timestamps on Naomi's financial records had been altered. The burner phone logs had no registered calls before the date of her arrest. Everything about the case was too perfect, too clean. She called her editor. "This is a setup," she said, her voice sharp with urgency, "and I can prove it." Inside the jail, Naomi sat across from her attorney, Hector Alvarez, her wrists still shackled. He laid out the prosecution's case, his expression grim. "They have everything lined up against you: fake transactions, text messages, eyewitnesses. Vaughn is making sure nothing gets thrown out." Naomi exhaled slowly, her mind working through the angles. "Then we make them prove it," she said, steel in her voice. "Every piece of evidence, every witness. We tear it apart." That night, Marcus Dean made a risky move. He slipped an envelope containing the flash drive under the door of the Richmond Falls Gazette, then disappeared into the night. By morning, the footage was on Kayla Brooks' desk, and within hours, it was broadcasted across the city. The video showed the police breaking into Naomi's home before they had a warrant. The headline ran in bold across every news station: "Evidence tampering in Naomi Carter case police caught red-handed." Langley slammed his fist against his desk as he watched the footage play on TV. Greer paced behind him, panic in his eyes. "They're turning on us," Greer muttered. Langley's mind raced. The evidence was out, but it wasn't enough to exonerate Naomi, not yet. He still had Judge Vaughn, still had control of the courtroom. But for the first time he felt it slipping. The lie they had built was starting to crack, and if they didn't contain it, the whole damn thing would collapse. And somewhere in her cold jail cell, Naomi Carter allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The truth was coming, and she was ready for the fight. Judge Leonard Vaughn sat in his chambers, a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck as he scrolled through the latest headlines. The footage of the illegal raid had ignited a firestorm. Protesters now filled the streets outside the courthouse, their voices growing louder by the hour. Even the mayor had issued a statement calling for an independent review of the case. Vaughn clenched his fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. Langley had assured him it would be clean, quick, decisive, unquestionable. But now the cracks were spreading, and if this case fell apart, it wouldn't just be Naomi Carter walking free. It would be Vaughn, Langley, and every corrupt official tied to them dragged down with her. Inside the Richmond Falls jail, Naomi sat across from Hector Alvarez and Elaine Patterson, a civil rights attorney who had joined her defense team after the footage aired. Patterson, sharp-eyed and battle-tested, wasted no time. "This changes everything," she said, tapping a stack of documents on the table. "The prosecution's entire case is built on that raid. If we can prove it was unlawful, every piece of evidence they found becomes inadmissible." Hector nodded but remained cautious. "Vaughn isn't going to make this easy. Langley still has control inside the courtroom." Naomi met their eyes, unwavering. "Then we force their hand. We put the system on trial." The next morning the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras flashing as Naomi was led in, her chains rattling against the polished floor. Across the aisle, Langley and Greer sat stiffly, their jaws tight, knowing that control was slipping through their fingers. Judge Vaughn entered, his usual composure strained, his gaze avoiding the journalists in the gallery. The prosecution opened as expected, reiterating their narrative of Naomi as a criminal mastermind. But when Patterson stood, her voice cut through the air like a blade. "The defense moves to suppress all evidence obtained from the raid on Ms. Carter's home," she declared. The warrant was issued after officers had already entered the premises, making the search unlawful. She turned to the screen behind her, where the damning surveillance footage played once again. The jury watched in silence. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Vaughn cleared his throat, glancing toward Langley. "This evidence is highly circumstantial," Vaughn began, but Patterson wasn't done. "Your Honor, Officer Marcus Dean has submitted an affidavit confirming that dispatch logs were altered to cover up the early entry." Gasps rippled through the room. Langley's hands curled into fists. Vaughn hesitated, his mind racing. If he ruled against the motion, it would be clear obstruction. If he granted it, the case would collapse. And then, as if sensing the weight of his own downfall, he made the only choice left. Motion granted, Vaughn said, his voice tight. The evidence from the raid is inadmissible. A stunned silence filled the courtroom, followed by an explosion of whispers. Langley's face twisted in barely contained fury. Naomi inhaled deeply, feeling the tide shift beneath her. The walls of the lie were crumbling, and now, for the first time, she could see the light breaking through the cracks. Langley felt the walls closing in. The moment Vaughn ruled the evidence inadmissible, everything began to unravel. The prosecution's case was gutted, their so-called airtight narrative collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The jury wasn't just watching Naomi Carter anymore. They were watching the system itself crumble, and Langley knew it. He exchanged a tense glance with Greer, whose normally cocky demeanor had given way to barely contained panic. They had spent years bending the law to their will, ensuring that people like Naomi never made it out of the trap. But now, with the entire city watching, there was nowhere left to hide. Elaine Patterson wasted no time pressing the attack. Your Honor, in light of this ruling, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges. The courtroom held its breath. Vaughn hesitated, his fingers gripping the gavel as if it were the last thing keeping him tethered to his position. His mind raced, calculating the odds. Denying the motion would invite scrutiny, federal scrutiny. His name was already being whispered in the press, his connections to Langley no longer buried beneath layers of backroom deals and secret favors. There was no way out for him now. Motion granted, Vaughn finally muttered. The case against Naomi Carter is dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Naomi exhaled, the weight of weeks of injustice finally lifting from her chest. The shackles were removed, her wrists red from the pressure, but she barely felt it. A roar of approval came from the crowd outside, the sound of justice being reclaimed. But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Before Langley could slip out of the courtroom, two internal affairs officers stepped forward. Detective Victor Langley, you are under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Langley's face darkened, his carefully maintained control shattering in an instant. You think this changes anything? He hissed as they cuffed him. People like me run this city. Naomi met his glare with a steady gaze. Not anymore. Greer didn't even put up a fight when his name was called next. Vaughn, pale and sweating, barely made it to the door before another officer intercepted him. One by one, the men who had orchestrated Naomi's downfall were led out in chains, paraded before the same cameras that had captured her humiliation weeks ago. The story had flipped, and this time the right people were the ones being buried. In the days that followed, Richmond Falls felt different. The protests didn't stop with Naomi's release. They grew, pushing for deeper reforms, demanding accountability for every case Langley and Vaughn had tainted. Investigations were launched, officers were suspended, and for the first time in decades, real change seemed possible. Then came the final twist no one expected. Less than a month after her exoneration, Naomi Carter was appointed as a special prosecutor for police oversight in Richmond Falls. The very system that had tried to destroy her now had to answer to her. The first day she walked into her new office at the police department, the same building where Langley had once ruled with impunity, she stopped in front of the door that now bore her name. Special Prosecutor, Naomi Carter. She placed a hand against it, a quiet moment of reflection. Everything they had done to silence her had only made her stronger. She turned, walking into the office with purpose. There was work to do. The fight wasn't over. But this time, the system wasn't rigged against her. This time, she was the one holding the power. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.